Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're really excited to host you today. We actually have a really fascinating topic, and I think an even more fascinating presenter. So I'll get into the person I'll be presenting today. It's actually Katty Kauffman. I'll go through her bio. I'm going to go through her bio in detail. It's fascinating. She has such a long professional history of really doing everything you could aspire to want to do in this profession. It's really impressive. And specifically around the presentation we have today. Hello everyone, everyone's starting to comment in the chat. That's fantastic. So the presentation for today, the webinar topic today is the future of the interpreting profession. Where do we go from here? And I was having a conversation with Katty, and she will introduce herself here in just a second. But I think it's fascinating in that Katty was saying, essentially, I'm going to provide more questions than answers, because there really aren't answers yet. But it'll be fascinating discussion just to understand a couple of things. Obviously, the world has changed since COVID. So what does that mean for interpreting? We've seen an explosion in demand for remote interpreting. And so we want to understand, how does the demand for interpreting services change as the pandemic starts to recede in our memory? We want to talk about what are the technological tools that are available to enhance interpreter performance, and what does that mean from an ethical perspective? We want to figure out what the new skills and new abilities interpreters will need as technology evolves, and the ethical and practical impact of those changes on the profession. And specifically, we'll also talk about artificial intelligence, what that means for all of us. So I want to talk a little bit about, I'll let Katty introduce herself here in just a second, but I want to go through her bio before I bring her on. And everybody's coming in. We have we're approaching over 350. So as everyone trickles in, I just want to go through Katty's bio. So Katty Kauffman is a seasoned conference and court interpreter. She's a member of the International Association of Conference Interpreters and TAALS. She's also an instructor at York University's graduate school. She was trained in Chile and in the United States. Her extensive conference experience includes presidential summits, general assemblies of international organizations, and countless events for the private sector. She regularly provides services in person, and more recently, as we know, given the pandemic, online, to the US Department of State, to the Organization of American States, to ECLAC, among others. She went to the Pedro de Valdivia School of Law in Santiago de Chile, and the certificate program in comparative US Latin American legal reforms at the Washington College of Law at the American University in DC. She's contributed to the Fundamentals of Court Interpretation, the second edition, and she's also a member of the editorial board. She is a federal and state certified interpreter and a frequent speaker across the US on the criminal procedure reforms that have swept through Latin America. So she's worked also as a freelancer in New York, in Miami, and DC, and she has served on staff at the US District Court for the Southern District of Florida. Most notably, in 2021, Katty received the Premio de Traducción a la Excelencia Profesional y Académica. It's Chile's top prize for language professionals. It was actually the first time in the 26-year history of the award that it was given to a full-time interpreter. So it's actually historically been given to translators. So I think that's fantastic. Really excited to hear your presentation, Katty. So I just welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, John, for that wonderful introduction. You know, I listened to that bio and I'm like, I did all that stuff? Really? Me?
You sure did.
When did I have time to do all that? Anyway, I guess it means I'm old. It has been a pleasure, and it is, of course, a pleasure to be here with Cross-Cultural Communications, as always. And it's wonderful to see so many people, over 400 colleagues online, from all over the world. I've been watching the chat as people have been,
Yep.
posting their greetings and saying hello from all these different places, from Egypt to Brazil, of course, the US, from east to west, Canada, all over. So it is absolutely fabulous to see everyone here. A lot of familiar names in the chat as well. To the colleagues that I already know, thank you for joining us. Those that I have yet to meet, I look forward to meeting you in the future. And on that note, without further ado,
Get into it.
John, if you'll allow me, I will start sharing my screen and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the future of the profession.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
All
Let me know if
right.
you have any issues.
All right, will do. All right. Hopefully that is now working. If somebody can just confirm in the chat, or John, just let me know that you're actually able to see that. That would be terrific. And we'll get started on that. Beautiful. Great. Let me just make one quick adjustment on my own screen here. There we go. Great. All right. So the topic, of course, of the day is this. Where do we go? The future of the profession, and where do we go from here? And we're going to talk about some possible scenarios. Obviously, there are many different options. So on that note, now, you may be wondering what this picture has to do, first of all, with Stockholm, right? I mean, look at the palm trees, clearly not Stockholm. And you're probably wondering what on earth Stockholm Syndrome has to do with the future of the profession of interpreting, and specifically remote interpreting. So just to be clear, the picture is not from Stockholm, and it really doesn't have anything to do with that syndrome. The picture is from Surfside, Miami. It's a before picture. Before what? Before this. The Champlain Towers Syndrome is related to Stockholm Syndrome in the following way. There was a tragedy. Many of you may have been familiar with it. This was in 2021, June 24th, South Florida, and it was all over the news at the time. If there's anyone in the audience that has a family member or was a victim of this, my heartfelt condolences, and I really hope I'm not bringing up painful memories by evoking this, but I think it's really important, and it's a really good example of something that's happened in our profession, and we don't want the same devastating consequences to happen to us here. So what does this have to do with the profession? Well, plenty. Why? Because just as what happened in Surfside and the Champlain Towers in Miami, the future was in full view of the residents. The residents there knew that there were serious construction issues. It had been raised at association meetings. They had talked about how much it was going to cost to fix it. But just like what they did, what we've seen in our profession with regard to especially distance interpreting is this. People stuck their heads in the sand and waited for it just to be all over. They didn't want to see what was happening in Surfside. And in terms of the profession and the changes that have happened as a result of the pandemic, we've also had a lot of colleagues who've done exactly this: stick their heads in the sand and wait for everything to go back to, quote, normal. Well, eventually, this is not going to work out. Just as it didn't work out in Surfside and everything collapsed, it's not going to work out in our profession either. We really need to make sure that we're not sticking our heads in the sand. So while there is a lot that's been going on in the pandemic, and there was stuff that was happening in distance interpreting even before, it's still a pretty cloudy scenario. We know where we are. We know kind of where we've been. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the clouds are definitely there. We don't have a clear view. Our crystal balls are not quite as clear and crystal as perhaps they could be. But here we are. We do know that after 2 years of remote interpreting, distance interpreting, we know that the industry has grown explosively. We know, and last time I think I counted, there were something like 17 different remote interpreting platforms out there. not including Zoom and WebEx, which technically are not RSI platforms. They're really video conferencing platforms that have a simultaneous interpreting function. They're very important, however. I mean, they do have this functionality, and of course, it works. I think many of us have used either Zoom or WebEx, and in fact, in this survey a couple of years ago, almost 73% of our colleagues said that 50% of their work or more had been on Zoom. So what Zoom does matters, and it matters a lot. Again, this study precedes the launch of the functionality on WebEx. So we're seeing here this percentage on Zoom. Today, there might be a greater percentage on the two platforms. But the point is that a huge percentage of all remote interpreting is happening on Zoom and now on WebEx. And it's been great. Obviously, without Zoom, a lot of us would have been in a really tough place financially. And I absolutely am included in that group. But where are things headed? I mean, that's where we've been, right? We have people sticking their heads in the sand, sort of ignoring it, waiting for it to all be over. Well, it's far from being over. But what is the future, right? Well, Zoom announced in 2021 its second ever acquisition. And the company said it was going to make communicating with people who speak different languages even easier. So they acquired a company, Kite. And just to quote what they said about this at the time, they said, and again, this is a quote, to leverage state-of-the-art technology and provide predictive artificial intelligence to deliver leading translation accuracy with low latency. Techno mumbo jumbo, right? But the statement continues. Transcripts and translated text appear in real time before speakers complete their sentences, and it self-corrects if it identifies a better interpretation after additional context. Kite says that when it comes to recognition, its system has an error rate of about 5%, with only 1 second of delay behind a person's speech, end quote. And they're not the only ones who are optimistic about this. We have Meta, also known previously as Facebook, being optimistic. The fastest AI supercomputer in the world when it's fully built out in mid-2022. I didn't see that happen. That was announced in late January 2020. And joining the fray, Google, more recently, right? And we've probably seen the closed captions on Zoom and WebEx, and we all know how inaccurate this can be. Amazing Google AI speaks another language in your voice, right? Designed to retain your voice and cadence in translated audio. Well, let's see. What does that mean for us as interpreters? I mean, that does sound an awful lot like what we do. We, quote, speak before speakers complete their sentences. We, quote, self-correct if we identify a better interpretation. We use input from, quote, additional context. And Kite says it has an error rate of about 5%. That may be a whole lot better than some of us. And only 1 second delay behind a person's speech. Let's all check our décalage. 1 second? I'm a lot farther behind than that. So what does it mean? Is Zoom trying to get rid of us? Are all these companies trying to get rid of us? Well, in a nutshell, yes. I mean, does it suggest they won't be making major investments to improve the current interpretation features? Probably. I mean, Zoom added the relay feature only after WebEx rolled it out. Would they have done it without that competition? Probably not. And based on conversations that colleagues and I have had with Zoom before that happened, they told us straight out they weren't going to be making any changes. So clearly they've put all of their interpreting, quote, eggs in the AI basket. Market pressure to compete, not the interpreter clamor, push Zoom into rolling out that relay function. So, should we all be scared out of our minds? Well, yes and no. Yes, because it's scary. And yes, because it's like Champlain Towers. We know the threat is there. We know that our world may come crashing down. But will it happen sooner or later, or not at all? And especially just because, like a Rubik's Cube, you may remember these little things, right? There are lots of moving pieces. And again, if you've ever played with one of these cubes, they know how you work. You move the blocks back and forth, forward, backward, sideways, and eventually everything clicks into place. But not quickly, not on the first try, and certainly not for everyone. I still can't do it. My brain just does not work that way. So yes, the fear is real. But also no. No, we shouldn't be scared. Why? Well, for several reasons. First of all, there's been this burst of activity during the pandemic. As others have said, the sector went from seeing remote simultaneous as interpreting as a marathon to a sprint. There's plenty of work to be done before the robots take over, if they take over. You remember that Google announcement? Remember that with pitch and cadence, right? It was designed to take over and do everything and have all this translated audio. Well, here's the thing. Here's another announcement, right? Oops, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Actually, not true. So here's the Google announcement. Facebook, Meta, had announced that they were doing all of these things, right? Well, it happened, just so happens, just in August, Google announced that it's not doing that. It's not using its own tools, right? So here we have Google. Amazing Google AI speaks another language in your voice, the cadence, and the voice in translated audio. And a few months later, all of a sudden, we see that they're now signing with a 3-year agreement with an Australian-based company for transcription and translation. In other words, Google itself, they've announced this amazing tool, but they're not using it for their own in-house meetings. So, cause to celebrate? Not quite yet. Reason for us to be relatively calm about the future of AI and those robots taking over? Yeah, it's a pretty good sign. What it does suggest, in any case, is that we do have time to adapt, to adjust, to learn, to up our game. Of course, the progress that we've made is here to stay. Now, you may think that a turtle is an odd image for a field in the midst of a major upheaval. But just like the lesson of the tortoise and the hare, we have to remember we're in this for the long haul. Distance interpreting, the interpreting profession, like the tortoise, is here to stay. Will it change its shell? Probably. And change it will. One form of changing shell that we're already seeing is hybrid meetings. The challenges for interpreters in those settings continue. Poor audio quality is the main one that comes to mind. And the fact that it's a huge learning curve for our clients. You know, they got used to working with us remotely, but this poses a whole new set of challenges. Just last week, I was at an event at a major university. Don't worry, the conference staff there said, our IT department has done this 1,000,000 times. I admit I wasn't convinced. So I asked, and we hopped on a call with the sound technicians. Turns out they had never run a Zoom call with interpreters and participants on site and speakers connecting remotely. So much for having done it 1,000,000 times. And just as I'm sure you've seen, many sectors will continue to move in this direction. Conference organizers have seen that it is possible to have the interpreters in one place and the delegates in another. There go my frequent flyer perks. Another change, however, that we're seeing is, as a result of all of this, is an increase in language access. More spoken languages, more signed languages. The recent changes to Zoom to allow for a greater array of signed languages is incredibly welcome in terms of language access, and it's a huge development. But it's not just those languages. Languages so-called of lesser diffusion. 2020 and 2021, I taught classes for colleagues in languages we don't hear as often in conference circuits in my markets in the Americas, North and South America. Urdu, Farsi, Pashto, Albanian, and they've all reported that their workload has risen dramatically during the pandemic. All sorts of new opportunities are out there for them and for us, for those of us working in languages with greater diffusion or presence in the US, primarily Spanish, right? But before we freak out about artificial intelligence and how Zoom and AI's funky new artificial intelligence system are going to make us all obsolete, we need to take a step back. Let's remember our history, because AI looks revolutionary. All these bits and bytes and techie mumbo jumbo. AI is disruptive, but it's not the first time. Again, let's take a step back. Let's look first quickly at translation. From the days of when groups of men, yes, all men, gathered around a desk with quills and ink pots, bringing their collective knowledge to bear, to the modern era, where our colleagues in written translation are using computers and AI and CAT and so forth, we've seen more than a few disruptions. And that's led to new professions, new opportunities for translators. They're making money using the same or a related skill set, pre-editing, post-editing, localization, and many others. And it's not just our colleagues in written translation. There have been huge changes, tremendous disruption in interpreting as well. We've gone from ancient Egypt to the Nuremberg trials. We've come a long way, baby. And let's not forget there was a lot of pushback in between. That really long diplomatic consecutive, as in an hour or more, that we saw before the advent of simultaneous on-site has pretty much disappeared. And believe me, those colleagues, they pushed back against simultaneous. So disruption is nothing new to our profession. So that's all well and good. We know that the profession, we know the industry has survived upheaval and tremendous change. But you're here to find out where we're going, not where we've been. It's a really good question. And as John suggested, I'm pretty sure you're here to try to get answers that I don't have. My crystal ball is in the shop and has been for quite a while. But again, let's draw some lessons from our colleagues in written translation and the consecutive to simul history and see if we can imagine some lessons and what the future might hold. The first message, the first lesson is this: don't panic. These challenges, these changes are not happening overnight. As I said earlier, we have time. And just as Google rolled out this fabulous system that they aren't using, this is proof of the pudding. We have time to adjust and adapt. And as interpreters, we also have a wonderful opportunity to shape the future of the profession. Don't fret, get ahead of the game. How? Well, by being prepared. Prior to the pandemic, I'd worked remotely twice, once from home, once from a hub. That experience perhaps put me in a better position than others to get ahead of the game. Did I put my head in the sand? Absolutely not. Even though many of us thought, this will last a few months and then everything will go back to normal, I jumped on board, figured out what I needed to do. That's the lesson. Get on board, get prepared, learn, figure out where you're going from here. So where do we go from here? And it has been a quantum leap. There's no doubt about it. We need to continue to study, to learn, to understand the technology, and to contribute to the process. Technology is not a barrier. It's a facilitator. It's an enabler. But what does that exactly look like? Where are we going? Again, crystal balls in the shop. So let me give you one possible scenario, one possible vision of the future. We have things that we can look to in the short term. Just like the coconut, there's some progress that is ready to eat. These include things like Kudo's Assist and a wealth of terminology banks and data mining apps, such as Sketch Engine's one-click term extractor. If you haven't seen Tech Forward's video on it, and that's Tech Forward, not forward as in moving forward, Tech Forward all together. They have a great video on, again, Sketch Engine's one-click term extractor. The tech is still developing, but it provides a fabulous way to develop glossaries and extract terms. I use Kudo Assist from time to time, and basically I put in some PDFs that I get from a client, and yeah, it takes some time, but the system does chuck out a list of frequently used terms with proposed translations in my target language. Does it mean I can forego reading all of those papers? Absolutely not, but it does make my preparation faster and easier. And let's be honest, conference interpreters out there, who hasn't tossed a last-minute speech that you get into Lingui's DeepL or DeepL to get a quick and dirty draft in your target language? I know I have, confidentiality permitting, of course. And DeepL itself has improved by leaps and bounds. That quick and dirty draft is now sometimes shockingly good. And it's a lifesaver when you're online, the audio is crummy, or the presenter is reading at a mile a minute, kind of like me right now, right? And speaking of change, there's a new interpreter skill right there. Sight editing for simultaneous interpreting. Interpreting schools, take note, it needs to be on the curriculum. You get a draft in your target language, you're listening to one, you're sight reading along and editing and making the changes on the fly. So not just reading from the original and going into your target, but reading from a draft translation and making the edits on the fly. New skill. We do have tools, of course. Automatic transcription is already out there. You may have seen it on Zoom or WebEx, but they're not necessarily what we really need as interpreters. You can't scroll back, and it's in real time, not delayed. So if we use it for consecutive, it's not much good because we can't see very much. You can now on Zoom go and see the complete transcript, but it's kind of clunky and hard to use. So what can we use in terms of the tools that are already out there, our short-term and currently existing tools? Well, basically in the world of automatic transcription, we have two options: paid options and free ones. So the paid ones include Otter AI, Sonics, Descript, or the virtual interpreting booth at Interprebank. And the free ones, such as Web Captioner and actually Word, right? If you have a subscription to Microsoft 365, you can use the dictate and voice command function in Word. I'm going to show you a little bit about how some of these work. So let's start with the freebies. Web Captioner is a free website. We don't have any expectations of privacy or security. We have to keep that in mind. And it's a fairly simple system. I actually am, due to time constraints, I'm not going to show you this particular video, but it's very simple. It's easy to use. You go to the website, you hit start captioning, you go to the configuration, you pick your language, and that's it. And you start the captioning. The other tool that we have available to us is, and again, this is something that most of us have, is in Word. If you belong to NAJIT, the National Association of Judicial Interpreters and Translators, you may have seen that there was a blog post, The Observer, that came out on Monday by David Peruano-Celli, and he talks precisely about this, and the blog post includes a link to a video on how to configure this on a Mac. Now, this is a tool that most of us have had on our computer since 2020. It works in Word, PowerPoint, OneNote, Outlook, and all the versions of Office 365. It's very similar to Web Captioner. You do need a connection to the internet, and you can select various languages, not as many as Web Captioner. You can also select punctuation and so forth. The only downside to this is if you click on any place on your screen while it's running, it will actually stop. But let's take a quick look at this. As you can see, I've got this configured. I'm selecting my languages here. I have two options for Spanish, for Spain and Mexico. And then I'm going to go and I have a YouTube speech here. Again, because I'm going to click, it's going to disappear, but you can see that that's the president of Mexico who is speaking, and I hit the button for listening.
El obstáculo para el ejercicio de ese derecho es la corrupción en todas sus expresiones. Los poderes transnacionales, la opulencia y la frivolidad como formas de vida.
And I'm seeing in the chat that there seems to be an issue with the screen share. If somebody can just confirm whether you are actually able to see that, that would be great. Okay, thank you, Lena. All right, great. So I'm going to try that one more time if I can.
De las élites. El modelo.
So again, I'm restarting this video. There's nothing worse than trying to do a live demo. That's why I recorded this in advance, right? So I have my different languages, and I've selected Spanish. I have a YouTube video that I'm going to use here. And again, this is the president of Mexico. And because I clicked on my screen, that disappears. But if you were doing this in real life, it would continue to work. There's a question in the chat is, what is the name of this tool? This is Word. Microsoft Word. You do need an Office 365. Exactly. It's the Word, Dictate, and Voice command. I'm sharing my full screen, so I can't make it any bigger. But the point is, you can see that it's actually transcribing what he's saying. Now, of course, AMLO speaks slowly, clearly, and so it works fairly well. That's one of those tools that we already have available. And again, if you go read the Observer blog from NAJIT, if you Google NAJIT, N-A-J-I-T, Observer, and look for the post by David Peruano, P-R-O-A-N-O, Celli, C-E-L-I, you should be able to see how this works. And again, he has a video on how to configure it for a single computer using a Mac. It's basically the same process if you want to do this on Windows. I actually prefer to route the sound through a different device and not do it all on one computer. I feel like it's an overload, but it absolutely can be done on one device. So you may be thinking, well, this is a piece of cake. Well, not so fast. First of all, we do need the right equipment. I just talked about routing the sound to a separate device. Again, I could do an entire separate webinar on that. John, take note. Happy to do it. But we really do need the right equipment to make this work. But there's also the ethical side of this. So sure, I'm getting this feed over the internet, but does that mean that I can transcribe it? Is that a recording for the purposes of a court or of HIPAA? Can I transcribe it, but then not save the file? Maybe, maybe not. There aren't any clear guidelines on this, right? This is the future of the profession. So if what you're doing is being live streamed over YouTube, there's probably not an ethical question. After all, every utterance is completely public anyway. But what if it's not? I mean, how do you decide? And again, this is a question for food for thought. I don't have all the answers. Let's just keep the ethical question in the back of our minds as we move forward. When you use these tools, you're sending the signal out to servers that may or may not be encrypted. And so they're really useful, but we do have to ask ourselves, what if I get hacked? Will my client have a fit? Will I get sued for breach of contract for making things public because I was transcribing and I wasn't allowed to? So really have to keep these things in mind as we decide how to use these tools. Okay, so that was the short term. Let's talk about the midterm. The path is clearly laid out. There are some curves, and we may have to double back from time to time as well. But we're already on our way. There are digital natives and people who are going to adopt these things really quickly. For others of us, it's going to be a little more difficult. But in any case, no matter what tools we use, we have to add them to our tool base. It's not like consecutive interpreting is going to go away. We still need to learn to do that. We have to be able to add these tools on top of it. And let me just quickly show you one of the tools that's it's out there, it's in use, but it's not fully flushed out yet. It's still in beta mode in many ways. This is one of the paid subscription tools. And this is InterpreBank. And what happens in this case is that you create a glossary. So you have to know kind of what the terminology you're going to be dealing with is. First, you can use those extraction tools, and you can then use that to help create a glossary. You take the glossary, you put it into the proprietary program, and then using that, you go into the artificial booth mate function. And when we play the audio, you'll see that what happens is I'm going to get an automatic transcription. And every time the speech is uses a term that's in that glossary, it's going to pop up in the terminology section. So in this case, I've used a video from the US Patent Office, and you can see that it's transcribing the video, and anything that is in the glossary that I posted, it's now going to give me my terminology, and it's also on the right-hand side giving me digits and time. It's not perfect, it's still in beta, but again, this is something that we can look to in the midterm for our future. But if we look a little farther, let's look at the long term. That is a lot harder to imagine. I mean, so many things can happen. There will always be a place for human-to-human contact because the meeting is confidential, because the participants want it that way. The reasons are too numerous to mention. But just like long consecutive didn't disappear, again, that hour-long maybe, but 10-minute long diplomatic contact, is very much still alive and well. And those of us that have been working in court during the pandemic have been exposed to the need for long consecutive. So just like it didn't disappear after the advent of simultaneous in 1919, on-site interpreting isn't going to disappear completely either. We know that the technology behind speech to text and speech to second language text is improving dramatically. We know that that is where Zoom and others have placed their chits. But is it what participants want? I mean, I can imagine that this is what the delegates' faces will look like when they try to read the automatic subtitles and the automatic transcript. We all know that speakers do not usually present at a reasonable pace. So in addition to presenting and perfecting the speech-to-speech translator, the algorithm will also need to learn to edit for content, lest our participants end up feeling and looking like that. I sometimes feel like that. So as long as we're imagining the future, why not imagine interpreters as superheroes, right? We can pick our future. And certainly it's a long-term option. Now, it may not be so far-fetched. Now, if you're desperate to buy this mug, it's available on Etsy. And for the record, I have no stake in this product. I happened across it and I said, oh boy, I need this. This is the picture of my life. Interpret to the rescue. So let's imagine a world in which Zoom AI or Kudos or Google's or anybody else's is up and running. And the interpreter is listening to the speeches and watching the automatic subtitling coming across, edited automatically or by a human to keep the pace reasonable. Suddenly, the interpreter sees a terrible mistake. The speaker said the micro lending program would make funds available for a family to buy a new car, which came up as car. The human interpreter, familiar with the context, speech pattern, and accent of the speaker, presses a button and the event stops. All mics are muted. All eyes turn to the interpreter, the superhero. Nope, wrong, so sorry. The interpreter thinks but doesn't say. Instead, diplomatically, our hero says, the word was cow, not car. The chair replies, thank you, Madam Interpreter. Thank you, Mr. Interpreter. You've saved the day again. And the event continues. Now, wouldn't that be nice? As we say in Spanish, dreaming is free. Soñar es gratis. Certainly dreaming is nice, but let's move back to the real world for just a moment. In sum, the pandemic has brought unexpected changes to the profession. We're still struggling, just as the world is struggling with new variants, to adjust to those changes, and they will persist for some time. Now, I started this presentation with a picture of a tower that had collapsed. Many of you may be asking, should we worry about our tower collapsing? I say, no, it won't. It may just look a little bit different. To get there, though, we need to prepare, to contribute, to remain flexible to new ways of thinking and new ways of working. I think the future of our profession is a very bright one, and I look forward to our Tower of Babel, the new one. So thank you very, very much. And if there are questions that I can answer, I'm happy to try. If there are questions I can't answer, and I expect there will be many, I'll say that I can't answer them because the future of the profession is largely one big, huge question mark. Thank you all. And on that note, I will stop share and look forward to any questions there may be.
Wow. Thank you so much, Katty. Soñar no cuesta nada. That's beautiful. I love that phrase. No, there was absolutely a ton of activity in the chat. Really, really comprehensive presentation. I'm just trying to, let's see, organize the questions. So we do have several questions for you. This is, and they come from all facets of the presentation. We have about 15 minutes. So from Eliha, how do you deal with pressure on freelancers? Somewhat tangentially related to the presentation topic. How do you deal with pressure on freelancers to lower cost estimates and hourly rates, excuse me, in the light of expansion of cheap remote interpreting and the rise of monopolies in interpreting technologies? So we're all dealing in a world that's a lot less focused on on-site. We're competing globally now with remote interpreting providers as individual freelancers. How would you, and as Kathy mentioned, we can't provide answers, but we can certainly provide some questions and some frameworks and some ways of thinking of things. And just curious to hear your thoughts, Kathy. I know it's not a simple one.
It is not a simple question. And there has been some pressure, even on the conference world occasionally, to present like, what is your rate per minute? And I just get these question marks in my eyes. What do you mean my rate per minute? And conference interpreters have, traditionally charged by a full day, and then we got creative and by a half day, and that's it. It's not even.
Because it took me an hour to get here.
Right. Well, not only did it take me an hour to get here, I had to prepare. I had to study. I did my research. I did my data mining. I did my glossary. I used all of my AI and all of my tech. But I had to read all of those papers. I had to read through the PowerPoints. I had to look through and try to identify what all of those acronyms mean and how I'm going to render those into the other language. And because I'm working in conference in a simultaneous mode primarily, I have to have it all right at the tip of my fingers, right? I can't say the interpreter needs a moment to look up a term. Gone. Especially when I'm working remotely, there's even more onus on me because I don't have my interpreting partner sitting next to me who's writing down words or numbers and so forth. Sure, they can send it to me in a chat, but because of the delay, because of the lag, it may not get there in time. So it's much harder working remotely, working alone and working from home in extremis, right, under these conditions, and not having my booth mate sitting next to me. So how do you handle the pressure to reduce your fees? And as professionals, we talk about fees, not rates generally. Just like an attorney, attorneys don't have rates. They have a fee schedule. Your dentist, right? Professionals have fees.
Absolutely.
So I like to talk about fees and try to get people in the habit of talking about fees rather than a rate. So when you're subject to this pressure, there are different ways to handle it. One is customer education. Look, this is what I do. This is all of the research. This is the bottom line. This is what I need to be able to make a living doing this. Sometimes, it can be really tough to say no. I think it's the hardest word in the English language. It's only 2 little letters, N and O, but sometimes no is the right answer. Can you for X amount? No. Just no. Trust that something better will come along. And you don't want to price yourself completely out of the market, but you do want to stay competitive with your colleagues in the market. If you let the agencies, if you let these, interpreting technology companies push you, pressure you, and sort of take over, then we're lost. There's really nothing we can do. If we all just roll over and say, sure, I'll charge for conference by the minute, then we have a problem.
We do have a problem. No, that's remarkable. And I think it was a prior webinar where the presenters mentioned or said very clearly, know your value, your value. And you certainly answered that question when you talked about the data mining, reviewing the presentation, creating the vocabulary, having everything there. There's computer systems, supercomputers, they're pretty extraordinary, but are they the human brain? The human brain, the most complex entity in the universe?
Of course, the human brain is much more complex. They're great tools. They're at our service. And they're getting better and better, which is great. But, how is AI? I always ask, when you have a speaker who speaks completely monotone and has no variation and they're absolutely flat, well, how do you know they're telling a joke?
Yeah.
Well, I know it because of the twinkle in the eye. If I can't see them, right? Well, AI is never going to see the twinkle in the eye. AI is never going to understand that that was a joke and that they now need to, whatever language it is, they need to give it intonation as a joke, because in Spanish, we don't speak in monotones, right? Jokes have a cadence, as they do in many other languages. And it behooves the good interpreter, if it's a joke, make it sound like a joke. But you have to be able to identify it's a joke.
Absolutely. Wow,
Computers not likely to do that in
They would, yeah.
Anytime in the near future.
If ever, if it's even possible. Yeah, Julio Jimenez comment, and this is from early on, 5% error is just as untrue as saying that Tesla's autopilot can drive a car safely through a high traffic area. Which I think if we think of the implications of driving an autopilot car through a high traffic area and the implications of saying car versus cow. At mass level.
By the way, that is a true story that actually happened to me, and I human misunderstood the speaker, and that's why I used it.
Okay, excellent. Wow.
Oops. And it was consecutive in front of 3,000 people. If you're gonna mess up, big time.
Yep. A question from Eliha. In your view, what is the impact on rare language interpreters in the North American market? So I presume, what is the impact of all of these technologies specifically in the North American market, maybe more specifically within in-person?
Sure. I think that these technologies have expanded opportunities for interpreters of languages of lesser diffusion or rare languages tremendously. They absolutely have expanded the realm of language access. There are all sorts of ways and possibilities for people to, in both, again, as I said earlier, both spoken and sign languages, to get access to a professional interpreter in ways that were simply not possible prior to the pandemic because the technology wasn't there. I think it is a tremendous opportunity for interpreters in those fields, especially if they learn to use these tools effectively. The world's an oyster.
Absolutely, wonderful. From Gulzama, here's a comment. AI translation does not catch expression, only words. You can't hear in soft and rude voice the same words have different meaning. We as humans have other expressions, the same words. So what you were referring to, the twinkle in the eye. And then a question definitely from Laura Rodriguez, practical question. What advice can you provide to me when my current employer thinks Google Translate is the best thing to use for migrants that come from Turkey and Russia? I've tried to sway them to use over-the-phone interpreting, but they think Google works better and faster.
You know, it is really hard to explain to monolingual people what we do and the value that we bring. I think looking for articles in the press about mistakes that have arisen as a result of computer error. There was a story, and unfortunately I don't have the link, and I looked for it a while back and I couldn't find it. There was a story about the Vatican, and it was actually a case, it was very serious. It had to do with allegations of child sexual abuse by priests. And there was a response from the Vatican, and the local parish used Google Translate to translate it, and it was not reviewed by a human. And terrible injustice was done. Let me just put it that way. So I think finding articles like that and examples like that can be very helpful. That, okay, yes, fine, reduce cost for this kind of thing, but make sure that there's a human that's reviewing or checking. The other argument is that, in cases of migrants, especially of Spanish speakers, there are so many different varieties of Spanish and so many different uses of language that you can be completely misinformed with a simple word that could mean elementary school, preschool, high school, college, depending on the country of origin. And so if you ask a simple question, what is your highest level of education, often asked in court, if you don't have a human who understands these nuances, you're going to end up with potentially a huge mistake, and that could affect that person's ability to get services and so forth.
It's extraordinary. Yeah, no, absolutely. so many varieties of Spanish, so many little things with nuances that that really only humans can pick up frequently, is that could lead to drastically different
irony,
responses.
sarcasm, right? The use of language, the use of terminology, context, colloquial expressions. I used a whole plethora of them in this presentation. We should have turned on the captioning and the automatic translation to see what it did with it, right? It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, agreed 100%. And examples, there's so many articles out there. Simple thing, use Google Translate once and then translate it back and see what happens.
Yeah, use it and then back translate it and see exactly. Yeah.
Let's see.
Estimado señor caballero, dear Mr. Gentleman. That's what it does.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a question. I see a question in the Q&A. Sorry to get ahead of you from Garrett Bradford.
Oh, absolutely.
About whether I see the interpreter professional associations leading the way in standards and guidance. I think there's certainly a role for the professional associations, whether it's the International Association of Conference Interpreters. IE came out fairly early on in the pandemic with a set of guidelines for conference interpreters working in extremis, working from home, sort of do's and don'ts. That was very, very helpful. I see NAGIT coming out with position papers on a number of different topics. So there is certainly room for the professional associations to lead. It's really up to the associations to do it, but absolutely, there's nothing like walking into a court hearing when somebody says, we're just going to play this video and you have the interpreter do the simultaneous or the consecutive, and the interpreter's never seen it. You walk in and say, Your Honor, there's a position paper from the National Association of Judicial Interpreters and Translators, and here's a copy, and that's not a best practice.
Yep.
That really helps.
No, that's powerful. That's powerful. And for everyone, the question was from Mr. Garrett Bradford. Katty, do you see the interpreter professional associations leading the way in standards and guidance? And the response was, we certainly hope so. It's definitely a whole new field. It's something entirely new. The push to remote, the influence of AI, the emergence of technology, it's just an unexplored area. And so we're really looking to the professional associations to take a stand in favor of what's best for the profession and what's best for the clients. So well said. Thank you so much. And it's definitely something we could all leverage as interpreters. Let's see. So we have a question from Elija. If the NDA states one can't use closed captioning, can we inquire with the interpreting transcription agency if they can share word captions for English with the interpreter for the sake of accuracy? So that's a bit specific in terms of the questions.
Yeah, that's a very specific question. It really depends on the language in the NDA. If you're told that you cannot use closed captioning, then you can't use closed captioning. If you are doing if you're in a court hearing and there is someone is providing there's a court reporter and you can get a copy, you get the court reporter's screen, then obviously the court reporter is authorized to produce that and to share that, then that's one thing. But you've got to be really careful with NDAs, and if it specifically says no closed captioning, then it's no closed captioning. No closed captioning. I mean, you can, certainly reach out and say, look, I signed this NDA, but here's this wonderful new tool that will really improve what I'm doing, and here's how I would use it, and here's what it involves. Can I get an exception? Sure, there's no harm in asking, right?
Absolutely. Very true. So we have a question from Elsa Gomez. Pretty straightforward question. Is there a federal exam that validates you in the legal area at the national level in the United States?
Yes, there is. It's the federal court interpreting.
Interpreters exam.
Is it interpreters or exam? It's FCCI. I took it so many years ago. I don't remember the name. Yes, there is a federal court interpreting exam. It is based on the Court Interpreters Act of 1978. That requires the exam. There are two parts to it. There's a written part and an oral part, and they're given generally in alternate years. And you can just Google federal court interpreting exam, and it should pop right up.
Excellent, excellent. As Andrew mentioned in the chat, for purposes of CEUs, you're no longer required to stay on the webinar. You will get your webinar certificate for CEUs within about 24 hours, as well as a link to the presentation. And so I just want to mention that. We will continue with Q&As, and Katty, as mentioned, you're welcome to hang out. I'm just going to go through the chat. We're going to try and address as many questions as possible, but I don't know if you have any prior commitments. You're free to go as well.
No, I'm happy to hang out for a little while.
Awesome.
I do see there's a question. I'm following the chat and the Q&A here.
Yeah.
There's a question as to whether there's an exam to be an AIC interpreter. No, AIC is a peer review organization like TALS, the American Association of Language Specialists, and it's peer review. You have to apply based on experience with sponsors and so forth. It is not an exam based. It's not an accreditation. It's a professional association.
Excellent. The school in North Carolina sent a letter to a mother stating your child needs to be shot. If you do not shoot your child, he will be taken out of school until you shoot him, from a Google Translate. So that's really tragic. And those examples really hammer home, really make it clear how important it is to have humans involved.
Yes.
The understanding. It's really difficult.
That's a great
to get.
Example. That's awful. It's absolutely awful.
Tragic.
Can you imagine being that mother receiving that letter?
Absolutely tragic. Okay. Let's see. Jeanette Lovell, do I need to send you my CEU number? No, we will send you everything you need in terms of applying for CEUs, in terms of getting your CEUs. Everybody loved the presentation.
Right. That's wonderful.
Can you post the recommended vlog?
Yes, I was about to say, give me a minute, if you want to explain the, making some concluding remarks, I will turn off my mic and my camera, and I will post some of those links in the
Absolutely.
chat.
Take your time. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, Katty.
All right. Give me just a minute.
So
thank you,
Katty's
everyone. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed being here. Thank you, so much, John, Katty. And to Cross-Cultural Communications for all the fabulous work you do in interpreter training and for hosting these webinars. As always, it's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to host you. Okay. So let's see, I'm just going through the chat. Just trying to address some of the questions. Is Lingui the most recommended dictionary for interpreters? It's actually a question I want to ask Katty in terms of which resources she uses to prepare. She does presidential summits. She does work for celebrities.
I guess my camera's back on and I'm still here. I do use Lingui. DeepL is great, and Lingui is great because it provides things in context. And as we all know, context for interpreters, king, queen, and the entire court. It is everything. Context is always the most important factor. So looking things up on Lingui really helps because you're getting really good sources in the original. Prose works, word reference, I use it all. I also use the good old-fashioned hard copy dictionary. There are a lot of really good dictionaries out there in print that are still very, very, very helpful, particularly with really highly specialized terminology. You just don't necessarily find what you're looking for online. And interestingly, even for things like conference terminology, that I have this photocopied version, probably shouldn't admit that, of a conference interpreting glossary from the 1950s.
Oh my goodness.
And it has every possible iteration in there of wherefore, whereas, where to, where. It's fabulous. And I haven't found that resource like that anywhere else.
That level of grammatical precision is really starting to, you just don't see it as frequently. What is the best way? Here's a question from Alicia. What is the best way for interpreters to stay up to date with all of these new tools? I have never heard about any of the ones in the presentation. So one way is obviously free webinars, of course. But Kathy, how do you think of professional development? How do you stay kind of on the bleeding edge of what's relevant?
Well, certainly belonging to professional organizations helps. So for example, I mean, I've been using this particular transcription tool for some time now, and I am now posting that link in the chat. This post on the Najit blog, which certainly will raise, awareness of this particular technology. The video is there. There's a link there that David has kindly produced on how to use it and so forth. He unfortunately doesn't address the question of ethics, which I think is regrettable, but we addressed it here, and everybody who's joined us is now well aware of that. So you can have the two things. So yeah, joining professional associations is a great way to stay up to date, because people are constantly doing things like creating these videos and so forth.
Excellent. So I just want to remind everyone, this is just a Q&A. This is a bonus. If you have a specific question, we're going to try and get to all of them. There are almost 100 messages, 91 messages. So we're going to try and get to all of them, but you do not have to stay on any longer. You will get your CEU email, your email with the CEU certificate within about 24 hours. Kathy, can you please share the link for your conference interpreting glossary, which I believe you did?
No, it's a hard copy.
What's the version?
I don't have it handy. Again, it's like from the 1950s. I don't know that it's out there. Yeah, never get rid of a glossary, never get rid of a dictionary, keep them all.
That's some very good advice. Yep, you'll get the link to the certificate sent to your email 24 hours from now. Please check spam, and you can always reach out to info@cultureandlanguage.net if you have any issues.
I do see an interesting question in the Q&A from Rosemary Hines.
Oh yeah.
She says, how do you feel about interpreters learning more about computer science in order to work with and inform tech engineers about our needs in the transition to more widespread use of computer-assisted interpreting tools, machine intelligence, and MT-generated live, machine translated generated live captioning? If you have the computer skills and have the penchant for that, I think it's terrific. I don't think that all interpreters should be expected to be experts in computers. If you have those abilities and skill set, then it's great. Certainly, I think that engineers can use a well-informed interpreter when they're designing things. There are a lot of programs that are not particularly well designed because of that. So let me give you an example. And I know that WebEx is actually working with a group of interpreters to try to fix some of the things that they got wrong in the first rollout. One of those is that on WebEx, the interpreters are given a number. So your interpreter number 1 or interpreter number 2 by default by the system based on how you were when you were at it. So if we're doing obviously team interpreting, if John and I are assigned to the Spanish booth and whoever's configuring the meeting puts John as number 1, puts me as number 2, then he's 1, I'm 2, and he'll get the tools to hand off, but I won't be able to see them. And that's a real problem if the two of us have agreed that I'm going to start.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to start, but I can't hand off to him using the tools on the platform. That's an engineering mistake because I didn't talk to the interpreters ahead of time. Again, they're now working on fixing that as I understand it, but that's just one example of one of the ways that a computer savvy interpreter can help the engineers do a better job on our behalf.
Yeah, I wonder if actually getting down to the level of code is really necessary, because what we need are use cases, and the computer engineer codes it. And I think where artificial intelligence is coming into play is, well, they're trying to code use cases or examples that potentially we have no idea if it's possible to code those. Is it possible to code intuition, understanding, perception, nuance, with ones and zeros? Code gets down to
Facial
a one or a
expressions.
zero.
Yeah. Good question. Like we said,
Excellent question.
more questions than answers in this webinar.
A lot of questions. What is the best online tool for legal term translation, in your opinion?
As a first-year law student in Latin America, the first thing you learn is hay que distinguir. A distinction needs to be made. It really depends, and that's the less literal translation. It all depends. Where are you? What legal system are you in? What are your codes? What are you working civil law, criminal law, family law? There's no single answer to that. I think the best resource is always the code, whatever that may be. So if you're, working in the Philippines, then you want to be using the Philippine legislation to decide what terminology you want to use in that language. If you're working from a translation from Mexico, you want to be looking at the Mexican code, not the Argentine code.
It really depends.
Go to the source, not the dictionary.
Very, very true. Let's see. Is this presentation going to be available online? You will get an email of the presentation, as well as a link to the recording. Any other questions? Any other new questions? Do you see any, Katty? A lot of interest in communicating with you.
You can send me if people have Twitter, I can put my
Twitter handle.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chats.
Okay, excellent.
Really
I just
hard.
want to remind everyone, you don't have to hang out for this part. We are just looking at the chat and trying to answer as many questions as possible. Thank you, everyone, for your thank yous. Katty put on an excellent presentation. I can think of no one more suited to to present on that topic than you, Katty. Do you increase your hourly fee for remote interpreting to at least partially make up for the lost mileage reimbursement that used to be available to on-site interpreters?
The discussion as to whether to charge more for remote versus on-site is an ongoing discussion. Obviously, when you're working remotely, in theory, you can take more than one assignment per day. In the conference world, that's always been a no-no. We try to take one assignment per day, because things start early, things end late, because you're trying to, if you're focused on US patent terminology, it's really hard to then spin and do illegal fishing in the afternoon. Your vocabulary wise, it's really, really hard. And so it's better just to charge for, that's why traditionally conference interpreters charge for a full day. But you certainly can do fairly easily 2 half-day events online, whereas given commuting times, if you try to do that on site, you're probably not going to be able to do it. But certainly I would not charge less for working online, given the investment in equipment.
And preparation.
The preparation is the same, but I should, if I could find it quickly, I could show you what my remote setup looks like. I have 2 27-inch screens, and then I have a separate laptop with a smaller screen. Basically, I'm working with 4 screens, 2 computers, 4 screens, camera, mics, different headsets. I mean, today I'm using a standalone mic, a Fifine, by the way, love it. I don't get any, I don't get any, any kickbacks or anything from, but I just absolutely love this.
No product placement
microphone.
kickbacks.
I love the product. I'm always happy to say, look, people, you don't have to invest a whole lot of money. It's
Excellent.
it's a standalone, and it's great. Love it.
So it's a standalone mic.
Yeah, it's a USB standalone. It's a $25 microphone. Best in class. Okay. That's F-I-F-I-N-E, fine. All right.
One more time. F-I.
F-I-F-I-N-E.
And you can get it online?
Amazon.
Okay.
Sometimes it's on sale for 20. Honestly,
instead of using a headset, that's what you use.
Right. Well, no, I mean, when I'm presenting, I use this. When I'm interpreting, I use my handy headset. Yeah, I prefer the Sennheiser. That's my go-to. But always have more than one, because some platforms don't play nicely with given headsets, and we're getting on into the technical.
How do you actually do it?
Than the future of the profession, but absolutely, you always need to have, and that's one of the reasons you don't charge less, because you've invested in all this equipment.
Absolutely. Makes perfect sense. Okay. Are there any other questions that you see? Three more. What is the brand of the headset? Sennheiser.
Sennheiser. Yeah. The one.
How do you spell that?
Probably not. S-E-N-N. Yeah. S-E-N-N. Yeah.
H-E-I. There we go.
Sennheiser. Yeah, you put it in there.
Andrew,
and I actually use the 665 and 660. Those are the two I use. The 665 has both a USB and a 3.5 connector, so I can play with the devices that I'm using.
Awesome. Well, that's fascinating. Fascinating. Okay, everyone. So just a reminder, you're free to take off. We're trying to just make sure we address every question. If somehow I missed it, feel free to, and you really wanted to answer, feel free to copy and paste it back into the chat so that we see it. So Fozzie, thanks so much. There's a link to, what is this a link to? Let's see.
The link, I posted the link to David's
perfect
blog.
Perfect.
You were asking about that blog on the AI and the transcription, on the Zoom transcription, or the excuse me, the word transcription tool. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. No, it does look like looks like we've addressed everything. One last look at the Q&A. What advice do you have for getting started, for getting a job in simultaneous interpreting? So if Katty Kauffman was going to start all over, how would she do it?
Well, the first thing I would do is go get an MCI, a Master's in Conference Interpreting. That is the very first thing that I would do, because it really is an area of specialization. Unfortunately, in the Americas, we don't have a lot of those. There's Glendon, obviously, as you know, I teach there, so I'm partial, but it is a very good program. There is the program at the University of Maryland, which unfortunately I understand will be closing its doors probably next year after the current cohort graduates. And of course, there's MISS and the Middlebury Institute for International Studies out in California. Those are the ones that are really available in this area, or in the US and Canada. I think there need to be more master's level program. I don't understand how two countries the size of the US and Canada have such a very limited offering in conference interpreting, but certainly that would be the first thing that I would do.
Compared to Europe, especially.
And there's a question about which mic, which V-Fine I'm talking about, and actually the flexible gooseneck is, it's not flexible, it's the rigid. Sorry, my bad. It's $25.99 in the US. And I will put this in the chat. Give me just a second.
Yeah. And if we didn't get to your question, please let us know. You can always email us at info@cultureandlanguage.net. We can reach out to Katty, make sure we get an answer to your question. And a question from Azan: does a master's degree in interpretation and translation studies work as well as a master's in conference interpreting?
Again, it depends on the course of study. If you have an interpretation program that does not have an interpreting booth, and those unfortunately do exist, then you're not well prepared to work in a conference environment. If you've never used conference equipment, never been in a booth, then obviously you're not well prepared to be a conference interpreter.
Very true.
Let me put this in the chat as well, not just in the Q&A. And this is the one that I'm looking at on.
So Maria Villa asked, is it possible to start as a freelancer with a bachelor's in modern languages, and how would you start? So it's certainly possible.
Sure. The reason that the recommendation for the conference level is that it is a master's in conference interpreting is that it's incredibly helpful to come in with a background in something. You're going to be a much better conference interpreter for NASA if you have a background in aerospace. I mean, sure, I can study, fields, but I'm never going to have the depth of knowledge that someone who studied a bachelor's degree or maybe even a master's degree or more in that particular field, then I'm just never going to get to that level. I mean, that's why I feel that my background in law is so helpful. When I walk into an event that I know is going to be very heavy in criminal procedure, especially, which is my area of expertise, I feel really comfortable. I know that I have all of the tools, and colleagues say, yeah, you can do that because you know this stuff, right? Yeah, well, I can do that because I do know this stuff.
And so that goes built into your rate. I'm sorry, yes, to your fee.
Into the fees, absolutely, of course. So yes, you can start with a bachelor's in modern language. You can start with a bachelor's in anything. If you have the language skills, and then if you want to specialize in that field. Now, there are going to be areas where it's going to be really hard because the niche is just so small. I mean, again, if your area of expertise is aerospace, yep, and you want to be an interpreter, and your language is Turkish or Swahili, or I don't know, I'm just imagining, right? It's going to be a very, very limited use case. So it really is going to depend on your languages, your background, your interest. I saw a call for an event not too long ago in Spain where all of the interpreters were required to be active gamers.
How cool is that?
So it's not just aerospace and what you went to school for. You never know. You never know.
Did you apply, Katty? Okay.
I did not. That is no. But when they need somebody with background in figure skating, I'm your client.
You got it.
Yeah, I got that.
Okay, so I'm just going through the chat still. Just a final reminder. You do not have to hang out. Thank you so much for hanging out, Katty, and helping me address these questions. I think do you see any others?
There are a few that are more on the techie side.
Yeah.
That have less to do with the future of the profession. So we can talk about doing a techie webinar at some point in the future.
No, absolutely. We'll reach out to you about that.
All right, great.
Absolutely. Well,
Wonderful.
No, we're going to go ahead and close this out, everyone. One last little reminder, you'll get your email with your CEUs within about 24 hours. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Katty, for all your knowledge and your insight and your expertise and sharing that with us today. We look forward to hosting you. We hope soon. I'll be in touch about that. And again, if any questions did not get addressed, please email us info@cultureandlanguage.net. We'll make sure and address those questions. And again, thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful day, wonderful rest of your week.